Hello, everybody. Good to sort of see you out there. Ramona Koval is my name. I'm a writer and a journalist, and it's lovely to be here with you tonight. I'm really happy to be in conversation with the excellent Kate Grenville, who I count as a friend, and she's also a writer of the most wonderful stories, most of which have their roots in the history of somebody who lived a life and left a scant trail of clues to what they were really like, I guess. Kate makes a deep study of history of her character's time, and she fills in the gaps and the silences with her wit and her wisdom. She really takes you there, somehow giving you a kaleidoscopic view of the lives and the times of her characters with her words on the page. Her playful, clever and resident novel that we're going to talk about tonight is called A Room Made of Leaves. It masquerades as the transcribed and edited version of a secret memoir written by one Elizabeth Macarthur, wife of John, who's remembered now, John is, as the father of the wool industry in Australia and a very difficult man all round. Kate, it's fabulous to speak with you from lockdown Melbourne to lockdown Melbourne.
It is absolutely fabulous, Ramona, to talk to you. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country here of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to the elders on whose land I'm speaking. And I don't know where you are.
I am too. So thanks. Yes, let's do that. Now, the editor's note at the front of this book says, basically, I've done nothing more than transcribe the papers in this box that I found somehow, and here it is, and I'm so lucky. I'm a transcriber and an editor of this kind of secret document, and I thought this was a really cheeky way of beginning this book, remembering what happened the last time we had a conversation about a book of yours, The Secret River, I think it was. And it was set also in the early days of settlement of Sydney and surrounds, but it led to reverberations in the, academic and history, literary community for 10 years. What happened?
Well, I picked the wrong metaphor. They asked me where I stood in relation to the history wars, which were raging in 2005. Some people denying that anything bad had ever happened in Australian history. Other people saying that, yes, indeed, Henry Reynolds among them. Here is proof that there were massacres, etc. So I wrote a novel about frontier encounters of a violent kind in the middle of that. And you asked me where you thought I stood in this thing about the history wars. And I said, I feel myself up on a stepladder looking down at these people all arguing about this. Now, if I had chosen, a fruit box or a couple of milk crates instead of ladder, I think I would not have got into trouble. But because it was a ladder, the way was then open for certain people to say, oh, well, she thinks she's, above us. She thinks she's better than us. She thinks she writes better history than us.
See, I never thought that that's what you meant when we had that conversation. I imagined you were standing on a little tiny, like a kitchen stepladder, so you could see better the whole landscape, not that you were looking down on anybody. So I was as surprised as anybody to keep noticing that this, amazing interview that we'd done was just reverberating down the years.
It is extraordinary. It's still reverberating in some ways. Look, I now take it as a great compliment. It means that I touched a nerve in the culture, or at least in those people. The book must have been something about something important for them to kind of have a go at me like that. So, in the long term, it was a good thing.
Because I think the discussion was, does she think that she's writing history and us historians, what do you think we're doing? And you're making stuff up and these things never happened. But on the very first page of this book, you tell the story of how the manuscript came to your hands, and you use the word unbelievably, unlikely, invented. So you can't really be accused of trying to hoodwink the reader about the facts of history. I mean, those are clues to the book, aren't they, those words?
Well, they certainly are. In fact, I say that they came into my hands through a chain of events so unlikely as to seem invented. If one can't say clearer than that this is a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kate, for those people who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading A Room Made of Leaves, can we get you to read that first entry from Elizabeth's secret diary? Because that'll give us, that'll let everybody hear what kind of a person she is.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So there's the editor's note in which I claim that I've just found the memoir, and these are the first words of the memoir, written by Elizabeth Macarthur in about 1840. My dear son James has given me a task for my last years or months or whatever time I have left beyond the many years I have lived so far. It is to compile an account called The History of the Macarthurs of Elizabeth Farm, meaning myself and my late husband, John Macarthur. He was barely cold in his grave when they began lauding him as a hero, even the ones who had loathed him in life. Surely it must be one of the choicest revenges of outliving an enemy, to look pious at his name, turn up your eyes, put your hands together like a parson, and mouth all the false words. The history of the Macarthurs of Elizabeth Farm. It sends a chill through my marrow. Even that least regarded word in the language, strikes me as absurd. How can there be the history? Beyond one the, watertight and trim, lies another, just as watertight, just as trim. But James has made the task hard to escape. He has trawled through all the desks and drawers and come out with every remnant of the past he could find to jog my fading memory. I look at them with a feeling like disgust. At some time in the unimaginable future, a reader will pore over all these items, looking for the past to show itself. To that person, and to you, the reader of these words, I can only say, do not believe too quickly.
There we are. And there's the clue and the cue to a lot of the things that you're doing in this book. It's a play between the ideas of invention and the facts of history. Like you do in this book, about what was going on inside Elizabeth Macarthur. So how did you start to get a kind of a bead on her?
Sounds like a big game hunter. Hemingway in the jungle.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. Look, I grew up learning about the Macarthurs, as a lot of us did, certainly in Sydney where I grew up. John Macarthur was, as you said in the introduction, the father of the wool industry, and his wife was always portrayed as this prim, devout, sort of devoted wife who kept the wool industry going when her husband was sent back to England for various things. Very dull, in other words, like all Australian history seemed to be back at Cremorne Girls High in 1965. But when I was researching for The Secret River, which I was doing in about the year 2000, I did some deep research and I came across Elizabeth Macarthur's letters. Now, mostly they are of a piece with that boring person that I had vaguely learned about at school. They're very correct. They're very impersonal. They're quite removed. They're nothing like, letters were public documents. They weren't private. So there's no sense of getting to know anybody through her letters, except for just one or two moments. And one is where she has asked for lessons from the astronomer in Sydney at that time, a man called William Dawes. Yes, she's obviously quite interested in Dawes. And she says, I got the lessons in astronomy, but I mistook my abilities, meaning that astronomy is a bit hard, which it is, and I blush at my error. And when I read those 5 words, I blush at my error, I thought, aha, there is a story here. Those letters, those acres of boring letters, are the mask. And just for a moment, the mask has slipped. I blush for my error. And she's talking about, a young man of her own age. Well, not all minds think like mine, but I immediately thought she's got the hots for Mr. Dawes.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the past and what people were like, even, a long, even further back than a few hundred years ago. But what do you think we can say about people in the past? I mean, were they just like us? Did the blush mean the same thing? I mean, they had the same bodies as us. They had the same kind of brains, although each generation thinks that they invented sex, don't they? Every generation thinks so. They couldn't possibly have thought about that because we just invented it. So how do you think about that? I mean, can you go back and think, well, this is the sort of woman she must have been?
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? The reason we can't think about the reason we have to think we've reinvented sex is because we can't even begin to imagine old people like our parents having ever had it. Yeah, going back. Well, look, you would know because you are, as you say, going back into deep time with your fabulous new book, A Letter to Layla, um, because you're going back to archaeologists and people like that who only have tiny little fragments of bone. And from 3 tiny fragments of bone, those amazing people construct an entire, Tyrannosaurus Rex or a certain kind of human. Find one more little chip of bone and they have to completely rewrite the whole thing. And in a way, that is a wonderful, someone like you who is examining those sorts of ideas, that fascinates me because it's exactly the same as any history, including the history of the last, pardon me, the history of the last 5 minutes, which is that we only have a partial, biased, prejudiced kind of account of it. We only see through one set of eyes. It's why we need courts of law so that we can hear all kinds of sides. So particularly from the 18th century, we are left with not just huge gaps in the record, like your archaeologists, but also a feeling that, it wasn't that Elizabeth Macarthur didn't leave any written record. She left a false one. So that's almost worse. Silence is actually at least honest. It acknowledges that there's nothing there. So when I think about those, particularly the women of the 18th century and of the past, I think there was no way that they could leave any truthful account of themselves in writing. And they hadn't yet invented the tape recorder, unfortunately.
And you can always lie on tape.
Well, that's true. Yes, you would know that as a broadcaster. So, when we say, how could they possibly have been like us? Because look, read these letters. I say, well, could they be that different from us? We all blush for the same sorts of reasons then and now. So I think that, I am a novelist, so I have no real problem with going into the gaps, if you like, in the historical record and speculating. And that's one of the ones. Certainly different cultures create different human beings, but below that or above it are eternal consistencies, I think. So I think that I have given Elizabeth Macarthur what some people will probably say, oh, she's much too modern. Well, how do we know?
Well, that's right. Well, we don't even know what our, contemporaries really think. I mean, people we love, people we live with, our children. I mean, who knows what they're really thinking? Nobody does, but a novelist does, because a novel is the only way you get. You've frozen, Kate. Have I frozen too?
You froze.
Oh, no.
Yes,
Okay.
you froze for a moment, but now you're back, and I was just.
Did you hear what I said? No, I was just saying that a novel is the only way you really get inside the head of another person.
Yeah.
Because there's no way other way, but they can say what they're thinking, but that you can't really know.
Yeah, that's right. And even a novel, every person reads a different novel. Every person who's ever going to read this book reads a slightly different one because they read it through the lens of their own experience of life, their own value system, etc. So there is no consistency, which is why the theme running through this book is exactly that idea of do not believe too quickly. Truth has many faces, and they should all be. Not to say that some things, not to say that everything was equally true, that idea of truthiness, not to say that, but to say that we should absorb all of those stories before we kind of arrive at our own.
Well, your Elizabeth Macarthur is a knowing and wise woman who's looking back on her life and choosing to tell the truth about it. So how did you go about explaining the childhood and young girlhood and womanhood of Elizabeth Macarthur? How did she get to be the way she became in the end? I mean, how did you think about that? Because you didn't know that much.
Didn't know that much. I was in a great position as a novelist because not terribly much is known about Elizabeth or John Macarthur, but just enough. And some of the things are that she was the daughter of a sort of small-scale farmer in Devon, a little tiny village called Bridgerule. And her father died when she was about 6, and the property was entailed, just like in Pride and Prejudice. The family home is entailed to the nearest male relative because, of course, you couldn't let a woman take over a farm. So she and her mother were turned off the farm and went to live with her grandfather. And her grandfather was old, and she was then sent to live with the local clergyman who had a daughter her own age. They were probably friends. So you just look at the actual facts. All that is on the record as kind of, one of the few things that are definite facts in history are those kinds of dates, births and deaths and marriages. So by the time she was 12, and then her mother remarried, and she did not take Elizabeth with her into the new marriage with the new husband.
This is a big deal, isn't it? I mean, if a mother does that.
Well, the way I put it in the book is that the mother said, look, you're in a wonderful place here with the clergyman's house. You're getting an education, which I wouldn't be able to afford to give you. What a lucky girl you are. I mean, we all know of, when there are second marriages, funny things go on, and the first set of children sometimes do get sidelined. So the mother remarried and very quickly had another daughter. So when you look at just those facts, what you see is a young woman who by the age of 12 has lost her father, her home. I didn't mention her little sister who died, her grandfather, and her mother, and is then displaced by another daughter. So by the age of 12, she has had to accommodate a vast amount of loss, and the fact that she is now a kind of orphan in this other family where she kind of has to be a good girl. She's kind of like a guest. Now, what would that do to somebody? It would make you, first of all, get quite good, I think, at appearing to be the perfect person, so that the clergyman's family wouldn't suddenly say, oh, no, you are not what we thought. You can, go off somewhere else. You would, as I've got her saying, fold yourself up small where no one could see you. And that then has psychological effects, because someone who has done that, who has had to conceal themselves and be a good little girl, what happens when the lid is lifted is often that the lid is lifted far too explosively and you make some terrible mistake. And that's what Elizabeth Macarthur does when she goes behind the hedge with young ensign John Macarthur, goes behind the hedge one midsummer night, and her whole destiny unspools from there. So it's the facts laid over with the psychology that we know from having been humans in the world.
But of course, she goes behind the hedge because she's a teenager, and she wants to experience what passion and sex is about. She's brought up on a farm. She kind of knows what the ins and outs of it are because she's watched the animals. So she just gives into her passions in a sense. I mean, we've all been there.
We certainly have all been there, and hers is definitely that, complicated by something that I think is also true. I mean, I'm old enough to have grown up in a time of great misogyny and oppression of women. So in that sense, I can absolutely understand how Elizabeth might have felt, which is that when a man flatters you enough, I'm going back to myself at 16, when a man flatters you enough and tells you you are absolutely wonderful, he is pretending that you have power. He is appearing to give you power over your destiny, which you haven't had up till there. And what I've given to Elizabeth Macarthur is believing that. As I say, she's taken the lid off her being folded up small. And no one has said to her, men will flatter you. So she thinks, oh, wow, what a huge colossus of a person I am. I have this sexual power over this man, and men are the powerful ones. Suddenly I'm the powerful one. So she goes into that with open eyes, knowing what she's doing, but somehow feeling that the rules aren't going to apply to her and that she's not going to get pregnant. And that, of course, is her big mistake.
So one does read a book like this and set in a historical period and with characters taken from life, and you say, did this really happen? Or didn't this happen? Or which is the bit that she's made up? And
Mm-hmm.
does it matter? And if it and why does or doesn't it matter?
Well, yeah, look, the historical record is very patchy, as you know, as the archaeological record is. So all you can do is a bit like our leaders with COVID. You can only make up the best story at the time, and if you have to change it, you have to do that. Now, we know that John Macarthur, as a young man, was unpleasant. He grew up to be an extremely unpleasant man, but he was already unpleasant as a young person. There are enough cues. So, and yet Elizabeth Macarthur, who is a very engaging person, married him. So, you know, you've got to ask the question, how did that happen? And the going behind the hedge. Oh, and the other thing, of course, is what the facts tell you, which is that she was, in fact, 4 months pregnant when they got married. So clearly, this was, or almost certainly, in my view, this was not a marriage of choice. It was a marriage of absolute necessity. The marriage was totally imprudent in all kind of, the culture of the time would have said impossible. John Macarthur was not only unpleasant, that didn't sort of negate his marriageability, but he had no money. That's what really counted. We know from reading Jane Austen, that's what it was all about. He wasn't even handsome. He was scarred with smallpox scars, and he was the son of a draper. So he didn't even have kind of aristocratic, he did claim a kind of aristocratic forebears, but he really didn't have anything going for him. So as a novelist, I could have agreed with other writers, other sort of non-fiction writers like Hazel King, a historian back in the 80s who wrote about Elizabeth Macarthur, and said the reason why they jumped the gun is that they were passionately in love. That is certainly a possible explanation. Given the sort of person that John revealed himself to be, I thought that was pretty unlikely, actually. So I went into my own experience of life and came up with this other thing where a woman can have that mad, reckless moment of feeling like a colossus and forget that actually there may be consequences. So look, does it matter? No. I mean, there are many accounts of this. The standard account is that they were so in love. My account is different. I'm afraid that unless a real memoir actually comes to light, we'll never know.
Well, you know, it's also about secrets and hidden things, you know, hidden things about the stories, gossip in the colony, all kinds of, you know, rumours. And one of my favourite bits is of course the love affair that develops between her and Dawes, and where the room made of leaves comes into it. But you know, I love the astronomy bits too, of course, as a science nut, and I love the fact that astronomy kind of taught that what might appear true was not true. The Earth going around the sun. I mean, it's obvious that when you get up in the morning and the sun comes up there. Anyway, I can't remember which way I'm sitting here. And it goes down in the west. And so it must be going around us. And, you know, she was shown by Dawes showing her a very sort of interesting little machine that he'd invented, or he hadn't invented, but he just put it together because it's the way you explain the solar system, that things that actually look like they are as they are actually aren't. And it's a fantastic example. I love that you put that in. What did you think about that?
It's a lovely image for not believing too quickly, isn't it? Well, I had already written about William Dawes, of course, in an earlier book, The Lieutenant, where I gave him I made up a name for him. Heaven knows why I did that now, but I did. So I had already learned about orreries, and I even understood a bit about astronomy in those days, though most of it's faded out the back of my brain now. It seemed to me, Dawes was the man that she got astronomy lessons from, and he really did make her an orrery, which is that device you mentioned. It's wonderful.
So it's got the sun in the middle, and it's got, you know, Venus and Mars and Earth and the other planets going around at their own pace.
Yeah. And the fancy ones even have a little tiny moon that circles a little tiny Earth. So that's a wonderful image of not believing, you know, what you see. The evidence of our eyes when it comes to science, as you absolutely know, is not what we need to look at. It's a bit like dealing with coronavirus. We can't see it. We just have to believe the scientists. They know a lot more than we do. But the other wonderful thing about an orrery, not only does it demonstrate that what we see is actually not what is, an orrery, all those different planets move at different speeds around the sun, but they're all impelled by one little handle at the bottom, is the one I'm thinking of that I saw in some museum somewhere. So one little tiny handle makes all these things move in totally different ways. And she looks at it and she thinks, isn't this amazing? Because there's, as well as her being in love with William Dawes, there's somebody rather fancies her. So there's this complexity of relationships, as there is in every small human society. She thinks how amazing each one of us thinks that we're making up our own minds about things, that we've got our own destiny, that we're carving our own orbit. But in fact, we're all being impelled by the same little handle, which is, you know, the desire to find a fellow soul, the desire to have sex, the desire to make a satisfying life. So we all, that little handle, but we have this illusion that we're, each one of us is kind of, you know, making up our own life.
Well, you know, at one point she says, to fool everyone is to live with great solitude. And yet there's always, towards the end of the book, an opening up of the unsung pleasures of being alone. and you know, not like, you know, a match made in heaven, like a romantic novel. Things, you know, go on, and life goes on. And we don't see much of this idea that a life alone is possible to live, and to live happily.
Yes, it seems to me that novels have missed a lot of opportunities to talk about the full breadth of human experience. I mean, it seems that since the novel was invented, which is after all not that long ago, and in the beginning it wasn't about love and sex. It kind of fairly quickly became that. But there's no reason why we have to stick to that. That's one story, falling in love and there being difficulties and then happily ever after. But other stories might be about discovering oneself, a relationship with oneself, which is one of the hardest relationships to work through, actually. It takes a lifetime, actually, to come to know yourself. And that can only be done in a certain amount of solitude. And yet it seems to me, like a lot of other really important human relationships, it's not one much dealt with in fiction. So I kind of have it both ways in this book, because I do give Elizabeth Macarthur a marriage which is a marriage to an extremely difficult man, where she has to do one kind of thing, which is to somehow manage this very difficult husband and manipulate him in the classic female way from behind the scenes or behind the throne, because she has no actual power. So she has that relationship, which is not particularly happy, but it has its satisfactions. You know, to manage somebody like that is to be quite satisfied. Then she has a passionate and very loving thing with William Dawes, which doesn't last very long. And then she comes out the other end as an older woman writing these memoirs, with having discovered really who she is and enjoying her own company, which is certainly one of the consolations of being older, in my opinion.
And I think I perhaps should invite you out there, if you want to ask a question of Kate. It's probably a good time to tap it out now, so we can get to it pretty soon. But Kate, did your idea of what the novel was about change with the writing of it?
No, not really. It took me 20 years to write because I couldn't work out how to do it, because I knew that I wanted to write a book that was about secrets and lies nested within other secrets and lies, but that it would also be saying something about the truth. So it would be fact and fiction, secrets and lies, all of it somehow in there together in the kind of slightly confusing mix that is real life, where we're trying to sort out, you know, all those ambiguities. Until one morning, it was shortly after I moved to Melbourne from Sydney. So I give thanks to Melbourne that the epiphany came to me one morning in my bed in Melbourne, that I could write the fake memoir, the pretend memoir of a real person, which could use some of the extracts from the actual real person, Elizabeth Macarthur, to use little bits and pieces of her authentic letters in the State Library of New South Wales, and then to build out from there in kind of layer upon layer of truth and fiction, all kind of dancing around together. When I realised that that was the way that I could tell this story, it was a magic moment. The other thing that I had trouble with was the fact that you cannot write, or at least I felt that I could not write about early Australia and two European people who had come and stolen, in the beginning, 100 acres from the Barramatigal people. It's not possible to write a book set in that time without addressing that fundamental fact about Australian, not just Australian history, Australian reality today. So that was my other dilemma, having written The Secret River, which is a book all about a British person who comes and takes, is the first white person to steal a particular 100 acres of land. I'd kind of told that story. Took me a while to realise that in this book, I could do something else, not to tell the story of the taking of the land, but to deconstruct the stories that the thieves told about that taking. So, 200 years of self-serving myths about, the good old pioneer days and what we did and what we didn't do have built up, and I could dismantle them. And that was the contribution that I could make towards this kind of ongoing project of trying to work out what people like me, descendants of those British people, should do about the fact that we're kind of on stolen land.
Because she talks about it as being the shadow at the edge of her life, like stuff over there that I don't really want to look at because I can't, because my life is like this, and I've decided to make her bed and lie in it, I guess. Yes. But look, Kate, we've got some questions. Chrissy Keek says, "Hi, Kate. Thanks for your insights. They're just wonderful. You mentioned that a novelist writes in the gaps in history and has to speculate. How comfortable are you with doing this, even in writing historical fiction?" So what do you think?
I'm perfectly happy about doing that. I know a lot of people don't like the idea of historical fiction because you don't know where the facts end and the fiction begins, and I completely understand that. In fact, I sympathise, and just between you and me and the global audience for this, I don't actually read much historical fiction for pleasure. I read it just to kind of get a sense of what's going on. So I completely sympathise with that. But it seems to me that if a book says, as this one does on the title page, a novel, then your contract with the reader is very straightforward. To say, if you want to know what really happened, go to the excellent work of those clever people, historians. But if you want another take on this, another kind of story about it, then enjoy this and take it with a pinch of salt. Do not believe too quickly either my book or the history book.
Yes. We have from Joanne Lockwood, given that women's stories are often not told in non-fiction or non-faction. She's written non-faction. I wonder if she means non-fiction. What role do you think the novelist can play in filling in those gaps?
I think the novelist has permission, at least I give myself permission, to enter those silences where historians are loath to tread, and they probably should be, because they have a much more difficult task, I think. The point about any kind of book, the whole point about the humanities, let's put a really big frame around this, the whole point about any kind of liberal arts or humanities study is to say, what does it mean to be human, basically? It's what your book is about too. Where did we come from? How did we get to the people we are? Where might we go? It's what we're all looking for. We want to understand not just ourselves as individuals, but how we fit in this big thing of, the human experiment. So if a book can illuminate that, whether by being factual or making stuff up, I don't think it matters, as long as it opens those doors and as long as it's truthful about what it's doing.
I've lost one of the other ones. What triggers your aha moment in choosing a time for your story to be set?
Look, I'm not the first writer to say it chooses me. Was it W.H. Auden who says a writer does not choose the poem chooses the writer? I always thought that sounded a bit kind of pretentious when I learnt that, but actually there's a certain amount of truth in it. I would have read many, many, many books in 2000, but it was the one in which there were extracts from Elizabeth Macarthur's letters that was the aha moment for me. So I think the lesson is, you can only spread your net extremely widely, get a very big net with a fairly fine mesh and throw it out over the ocean of life, and stuff will come in and you will know the aha moment when it arrives, but it can't be forced and it can't be faked. So if you think, oh, I've written about this and I've written about that, so perhaps next time I should write about such and such, I think that's probably a recipe for disaster. But when you haul in the net and some little gleaming minnow is there and you think, that's the one I like, I think you have to trust that feeling.
But this minnow was there for 20 years too. I mean,
yeah, it should have grown into a whale.
True grit. So you're not prepared to just let it fly off or swim off, are you? You're going, I think I'm going to have that I'm just going to keep it here and see what happens.
I put it in a little goldfish bowl and let it swim around. I mean, look, in that 20 years, I wrote 6 other books. So, there was plenty of time.
No, you're no slacker, Kate.
No slacker. That's right. I'm a hard worker. But I also am a great believer in the unconscious and putting things aside to kind of do something in your unconscious rather than thinking it through consciously. Just put it in there and let it kind of percolate. Go for lots of long walks and do whatever you do, play music in my case, to switch off the brain so that stuff can kind of come up from the unconscious. And over 20 years, stuff happens.
It's a cello, isn't it?
It's the cello, yes. Sadly neglected in this time of COVID, I'm afraid.
Why? Can't you do it by yourself? Or you're not doing it? You usually play with others, don't you?
Well, that's right. And what keeps you practicing the C minor scale is the utter humiliation that you're going to suffer when you meet with your piano trio and you can't, get E flat properly. So that is a huge spur to practice. And without being able to meet with my piano trio or my orchestra, it is much more difficult to make myself sit down and play the C minor scale.
Well, Pam Barber says, please consider writing about successful solitude and a relationship with self. With so many of us single, that would be a wonderful novel with which to engage. A relationship with self is perhaps the most difficult of all.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Well, I think I've in a way done that in this book. It's lots of relationships, but that's one that I have always enjoyed my own company. And I've always felt that there must be something really wrong with me, because the assumption in our particular society is that one can only be happy in company with other people, that you have to be part of a couple or some sort of partnership. And failing that, you've got to, be sociable in all kinds of ways. Well, actually, maybe not. Who says? I mean, in the past, there were many people, they were, of course, men. Well, I suppose there were all those women in convents and stuff who are often alone. I'm thinking of people like Montaigne, who put himself away in a tower for years and wrote those fabulous things and clearly was having a very good time. So
on Solitude.
On Solitude, yeah. So I think it shouldn't be scorned the way our particular culture is rather scorning solitude. It should be honoured.
Someone, Bernadette Flynn says, do you consider Elizabeth to be an unusual woman for her time and situation?
Look, it's a good question. I think she would be, women of her kind of resilience, humour, irony, intelligence are probably rare at any time. I think there were probably as many of them back in the day as there are now. It's just that most of them, the poor things, we would go mad living the limited lives, condescended to by men, forbidden to even learn to read and write very often. We would have gone crazy. Of course they would have too. So I think we have to do them the honour of assuming that many of them were at least as interesting, as ambitious and as talented as anybody today.
Kate, this might be nearly the last question, but I forgot to ask you about sheep, because you know an awful lot about sheep. Of course, John MacArthur was away for 11 years or something, wasn't he? And when the whole sheep thing was building up. So Elizabeth was actually the one that was doing all the sheep stuff, and she had the sheep experience from when she was back in England. But I know that you did a lot of research on genetics and sheep and all kinds of matings that they needed to do.
Yep.
But you can't put everything in a book, can you? How much do you know about sheep, and how much was it hard to resist putting more about the sheep in the book?
There's an awful lot on the cutting room floor about sheep. I think people probably have, I'm a secret nerd, as you're perhaps a more shameless nerd. I love all that stuff. The genetics of merino plus fat-tailed South African sheep is extraordinary. John MacArthur and Elizabeth too probably thought they were terribly clever producing these brilliant merinos. In fact, it's now discovered it was an incredible fluke that those two genetic bits of sheep happened to make these fantastic sheep. They are sadly underestimated sheep, and I spoke to several sheep people who taught me what I know, and I thank them very deeply.
Peter, Megan Pearson says, are there any books or authors that influence you? Any Indigenous works or authors you would recommend?
Aha, yes, that's a fabulous question. Thank you for asking it, because the wonderful thing about writing today is that the white story, the settler story of those early days is now being filled in by Indigenous people telling that aspect, that perspective. So I've just read, Tara June Winch's book is fabulous. Alexis Wright's book, Carpentaria, teaches us another whole way that a novel can be written. It's an extraordinary work. And I've just read a book called Benevolence, which happens to include my great-great-great-grandfather, Solomon Wiseman, as a cameo character, written by a Darug woman. And it's a kind of, in the same time and place as my book, The Secret River. That is so fantastic. So there's a wealth of stuff out there.
And Peter Ellis says, C minor. I can agree, but on the violin, Kate, how to practice without a reason to rehearse?
Ah, yes.
Is this the problem?
That is the problem, yes.
Because there's no deadline there.
There's no deadline. And of course the challenge should be enough, if I was a proper person, if I was a musician, the challenge would be enough. I hasten to say I'm a terrible cellist. I'm very much a beginner. But it is satisfying. And when I make myself sit down to it and think, right, today is the C major, I get totally absorbed. And it's then that I have those, or just after that, I discover that I might have a little aha moment. So maybe instead of tempting myself with the humiliation of being with the string with the other people, I can say I might get the reward of an aha moment if I practice C minor.
Well, this is our last questions tonight. What did you say?
Or even C major.
Or even C major, right. Paige Turner is asking, what's the best piece of writing advice you've had?
Okay. When I was at the University of Colorado, somebody said to me, just go with the energy. Go with the energy. 4 words. And they were so right. If something is hard work to write and it's coming out a bit boring, just forget it. It's never going to work. Start somewhere else.
Never. It'll never work.
Oh, well, in my experience, you can force it to work if you absolutely have to, but actually far better to abandon it like a bit of failed knitting and just, get a new ball of wool and cast on again.
What good advice there. Well, look, I think that's our last question and our fantastic advice. So everybody, I've loved talking to Kate tonight. I hope you enjoyed listening to her. And the book, of course, is The Room Made of Leaves. A Room Made of Leaves. A Room Made of Leaves, because I've got to have it just here. And I think there's a little thingy that you can press on and you can buy it on this Facebook page. And I think you should if you haven't. And if you haven't yet, I think you're dying to now, because listening to Kate, it's marvellous. We're very lucky to have Kate. And Kate, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you, Ramona. You have been absolutely fantastic. And
well, we've had a lot of fun.
We've had a lot of fun. And thank you to Dymocks. We authors could not manage without the support of good booksellers like Dymocks.
Absolutely. Yay. And everybody, get reading.